Hello, and welcome to A Critical Dragon, where I talk about narrative in film, television, and in books. And this video is going to be about the show don't tell approach to characterization, or at least part of that. It's really more about subtextual implications and the analysis that we can get, and the information that we can extract from subtextual information. From beneath the text, things that are being implied. And people refer to it as show don't tell, but really it's all about understanding what's on the page, why it's in that order, and the things that are implied or the connotations that things have, and how that adds to our understanding and our picture of what is going on. Now, in terms of spoilers, this is from chapter 16 of House of Chains. It's 3 characters that I'm going to be discussing. There is a slight reference to the context. I'm not going into huge revelations about these characters. It's more about how the characters are being shown on the page. But if you don't want any spoilers, I appreciate you watching this far, but this is chapter 16 of House of Chains, so there will be spoilers. For those of you that have stayed, thanks for staying. Hopefully this will demonstrate what I mean when I say show don't tell, or when I say subtextual. Other people have slightly different interpretations. It's fine. It's literary analysis. Everyone's an individual. But I want to look at this sequence in chapter 16 that involves Cutter, Cotillion, and then the follow-up sequence, which is Cotillion and Shadowthrone. That's the sequence I'm talking about. So this is following the battle on Drift Avalii. Cutter has a bruised shoulder. Apsalar is wounded and kind of knocked out. Cotillion's killed a whole bunch of people. And now we've joined in the aftermath of the battle. So the scene opens with Apsalar in his arms. Cutter emerged from the gateway. The woman's weight sent waves of pain through his bruised shoulder, and he did not think he would be able to carry her for long. 30 paces ahead, at the edge of the clearing where the 2 trails converged, lay scores of corpses, and in their midst stood Cotillion. So, as is very common in narrative everywhere, the start of a scene, the start of a new scene, quite often lays out the physical setting so that we can picture it in our minds what is happening. So what is happening here? Cutter's standing there, and he's walking along, and he is holding Apsalar in his arms. And one of his shoulders is bruised, and it's paining him. Apsalar, has a weight, and that's making it sore. And ahead of him, he's on one path, there's another path, they converge into a clearing, and in that clearing, Cotillion is standing there, and he's surrounded by dead bodies, scores of corpses. There are a lot of bodies. So you go, okay, fair enough. This is a straightforward, I can picture this in my mind. And you go, that's the literal meaning. That's the surface meaning. That is what is being told to us, what is being described. So now let's think about it in terms of the symbolism, in terms of metaphor, in terms of a subtext that is being woven for us. Cutter is carrying Apsalar quite literally, but think of their relationship in the book up until now. Cutter has chosen to go from being Crocus to being Cutter, to try to please Apsalar, to try to help Apsalar. And even though she didn't ask him to do that, that is a burden that he has assumed. This change, this transition, that's a burden. And it's a burden that he associates with Apsalar. So Apsalar in his arms as a weight, as a burden. There's this metaphorical burden. But we also know that their relationship is strained, that Apsalar, through her presence, causes Cutter emotional pain. Now, part of this is he's an adolescent becoming a mature grown-up and trying to navigate, being an adult. But Apsalar's presence causes him pain. So again, he's carrying Apsalar in his arms. She's causing him pain. But figuratively, Apsalar causes Cutter pain. We then think of the emotion associated with all of this. How did Apsalar get wounded? She was basically protecting Cutter. It's Cutter's fault that Apsalar is wounded. Therefore, he feels guilt. How do we deal with guilt? A number of different ways, but one of the ways is trying to blame someone else, that this guilt is a pain, it's a burden, it weighs us down. He's being weighed down by his guilt about Apsalar. You don't need to wholesale believe in all of these things, but I think that phrasing suggests all of these things. And when they're all suggested together like that, I believe it signifies author intentionality, that this is intended by the author, that we are meant to pick up on these things, that this isn't an accident. But let's think of the idea of the two paths. So we're told Cutter, carrying Apsalar, is walking along one path. And at the end of that path is a clearing where the god of assassins is standing, surrounded by dead bodies. Now, straightforward, literal interpretation, yeah, I can see the scene. Let's think about it in terms of subtext. Crocus made life decisions to become Cutter. Cutter is training to become an assassin, a hired killer. He is on his way to becoming an assassin. He is journeying toward being an assassin. And I think you can see where I'm going with this. He is walking on a path toward Cotillion, the god of assassins. We have a symbolic reading of the physical action. And what does this path lead to, his future lead to, if he becomes an assassin, if he keeps going in that direction? And here we get into a reading of what perhaps is influencing Cutter's mind at this point. His future, where he's going to be very, very shortly, is standing with Cotillion. But his future, metaphorically, he's going to be an assassin, surrounded by scores of dead bodies, surrounded by the bodies of his victims. And what is Cotillion doing here? Cotillion is surrounded by these dead bodies, and he's staring at the body of a female friend. Cutter is holding the body, admittedly breathing, of a female friend. That these points of connection are being drawn between these two characters. Cutter is literally heading toward becoming an assassin, surrounded by all of these dead bodies of all these people he's killed. And potentially in the future, he will be that person standing in a clearing, looking at the body of Apsalar, because it's very close to that now, because he's holding Apsalar. And when we think about it in those terms, when we get to this exchange that he has with Cotillion, where, let me just scroll down to see if I can actually find what Cutter says. So Cutter approaches Cotillion, and he sees that Cotillion is looking at this dead body, is crouched next to this dead body. And he says, "You knew her?" "Hawl," he replied after a moment. "I thought that Surly had taken them all out. None of the Talon's command left. I thought she was dead." "She is." Then he snapped his mouth shut, a damned miserable thing to say. So Cutter, when he sees Cotillion upset with Hall's death, all he can say is, "She is." This idea, "I thought she was dead, she is." This is mean. This is nasty. This is lashing out. This is anger and frustration, because up until now, Cutter has not appeared that way. Cutter is not a nasty, horrible individual. He's an adolescent becoming an adult, but he's not horrible and mean. So why does he say this? And then he says this, he even admits to himself that this was a horrible thing to say. He realizes this is incredibly harsh. So we have to ask ourselves, why does he say it? And I would argue that a lot of this is wrapped up in Cutter's frustrations. He's in physical pain. He's in psychic pain. He's frustrated with himself because he thought, and we've seen this in his earlier scenes, he thought becoming Cutter would make him into someone else, would make him better, would make him more powerful, would make him more confident, would make him more attractive to Apsalar, would make him more. But Cutter is still Crocus inside, because all these things that he does, he's still the same person. You can't just change who you are. You can grow, but you can't just go, oh, well, now I have a new job. I'm a completely different person. My personality has changed. I'm much more confident now. I don't think it really works that way, that you have to grow into these things. And Cutter hasn't done that yet. So he's feeling frustrated that he's made these decisions. He's tried to do these things to impress Apsalar, and she's not impressed. So it hasn't worked. That's frustrating. He thought that when they arrived at the island, he had survived, and he thought Apsalar had died. He was worried about her. He was starting to grieve for her. And whose fault was that? That was Cotillion's fault. Cotillion sent them there. But then Apsalar turns up alive, and she saves him. So he is saved, and therefore she's more powerful, and he's made to feel weak again, and that's Apsalar's fault, but it's not Apsalar's fault. It's definitely Cotillion's fault because Cotillion sent them there. Apsalar is then wounded. The woman he claims that he loves is wounded, and whose fault is that? It's Cotillion's fault. All of this anger, all of this rage, all of this frustration needs an outlet. And the only outlet that he can find is Cotillion. Cotillion is standing there. And it's all Cotillion's fault. So yeah, let him feel the pain. And then we have this moment at the very end of this section. There's more you can go through this whole section, and there's actually more you can unpick. But, I think I've given you a sense of what's going on. So, there's enough there for you to delve into. And the point that I want to pick up just at the end of that section is Cotillion is standing with Hall's body. Cutter is standing with Apsalar's body, although she's still breathing. And Cotillion kind of looks at the two of them and basically is like, look at the two of us. And Cutter sees this and says, not the same. Because this is a consolidation of his fear that he will become Cotillion, that he will be on his own, surrounded by the dead, staring at the body of his loved one. And in that moment, Cutter is faced with this lonely, dark future, and he is angry and fighting against it. There's an interesting thing with the Talon, the exchange of the Talon, which I would encourage you to look into yourself. But that line, not the same. Have a look at that and see what you think, because I really think this speaks a lot about Cutter's fears, that gives him this depth of personality that, isn't spelled out on the page, but I think actually comes across quite powerfully. But moving on to Cotillion then, and we're going to look at that whole sequence again, but this time sort of more focused on Cotillion, and then the sort of the follow-up sequence, a couple of points about the interaction with Shadowthrone. And one of the things is Cotillion is initially presented as we go through, because we don't see a lot of Cotillion, we don't get a lot of interaction with him. A lot of what we see, we have this very sketched outline of who Cotillion is, what he is. He's the god of assassins. He's this feared warrior. He has this legendary past as Dancer the assassin. But we don't really have a sense of who he was as a person. And so we project a lot onto this. And we think he expresses regret about what he did to Sari. And yet he doesn't express regret for what he did to all of those villagers at the start of Gardens of the Moon. And you could say, well, that's inconsistent. If he feels regret for one thing, he should feel regret for the other. And I'm not convinced by that because, number one, we all do things where we rationalize what we did as necessary and therefore don't feel guilty about it. Number two, because he possessed Sari, he was with her, he experienced all of these things, he knows her. And that makes it a lot more personal. Whereas all of those villagers that, he's partially responsible for killing, they're all strangers. We feel a lot more guilt for things that we do to people we know than generally things that we do to people we don't know. That's kind of how a lot of how our psyche and emotions work. And so Cotillion feeling regret and sorrow over what he did to Apsalar seems perfectly human. And yet, he's a deity. He's the god of assassins. He is cold-hearted. We have just seen him kill a whole load of people without breaking a sweat, without getting angry, without yelling some sort of barbaric yop and going into a berserk rage. He did it coldly and clinically and precisely. And you go, is that contradictory? And again, we think, well, we as people are flawed. We're full of these contradictions. And so realizing that on the page, if he only behaved in one way, you could say that's far more consistent. But at the same time, it runs the risk of him becoming two-dimensional, becoming a cookie cutter of the cold psychopathic assassin. And if he constantly had this sort of bleeding heart for all the trouble he caused, you're falling into another trope, the idea of the assassin with a heart of gold, which again feels tropey and it doesn't feel like a real person. But a person who has both regrets and things that he's perfectly fine with, that seems a lot more real to me, at the very least. So I think that is an interesting way to approach Cotillion, that there's an implication that he's a flawed character, that he has depth. And if we start with that assumption, then we can look at this scene. So at the start of the scene, obviously, Cotillion is surrounded by these bodies, and he's standing over Hall's body. Hawl was a Talon, one of Cotillion's specific followers. So not necessarily a follower of Shadowthrone, a Talon, a follower of Cotillion's. And he knew her. They were old friends. They have a long history. So we have him standing there. He's looking down. That physical scene, that superficial, that surface level, setting the physical scene. Now think about it metaphorically. Again, there were two paths leading to this clearing, and Cotillion has clearly come down one of them. So Cotillion followed a path, and that path ended with the death of a friend and him being surrounded by all of these bodies and him standing on his own. The decisions that he made in his life, the decisions, the plans, the journey that he and Kellamved went on led to this moment. So there's a temporal journey. His decisions led to a moment where he was standing there looking at the body of a dead friend. That same metaphorical reading that we did for Cutter applies just as equally to Cotillion. And it gives us this sense that, Cotillion is not two-dimensional. He isn't just an assassin. He actually is a slightly more rounded character than we may have initially thought. And then we see this moment where the god slowly settled down into a crouch, reaching out to brush hair back from the corpse's face. And Cutter is brought up short by Cotillion's expression, the ravaged look that made him suddenly appear 20 years older. The gloved hand that had swept the hair back now caressed the dead woman's scorched face. So what we see here, Cotillion moving slowly, Cotillion taking his time. Now, that could be hesitancy because he doesn't want to confirm that it's Hawl. Or it could be he's lost in a reverie, that he's seeing this and he is taking his time to drink it in, to come to terms with the fact that a friend is dead. Both of those are very natural reactions because we know Cotillion can move inhumanly fast. There's no reason for him to slowly do anything if he wants to. So his slowness here, settling down, that is deliberate on his part or unconscious on his part because he doesn't want to confirm this. He doesn't want to confront this, which is an implication of his character. And then we find out that Cutter witnesses this look on Cotillion's face that makes Cotillion look 20 years older. It's a ravaged look. This is pain, raw grief. And that's the thing that ages Cotillion in that moment. And even Cutter can see it. Cutter, who is, let's say, he's not the sharpest tool in the box, and he's not the most observant, but even he can see how affected Cotillion is by the death of this woman, Hawl, this Talon, this follower, this friend. And because Cotillion then reaches out and caresses her face, he has gently moved her hair out of her face, he's gently touched her face. This is remembrance and respect and loss and grief, all in this moment. This isn't something that is just the superficial or the surface level description of an action. There is an intentionality here. There is an emotion here that is not being spelled out on the page. And we realize, I think, in this moment, and I think this is the moment that really consolidates it, because up until now, Cotillion's kind of been a badass, he's been kind of cool, or he's been a bit of an asshole. But it's in this moment that we realize he's an actual person as well as a god. And when Cutter has that exchange for him, you knew her, Hawl, and then Cutter basically said, I thought she was dead, and Cutter says she is. Cotillion carries on by saying, I made them good at hiding. Cotillion is ignoring or not hearing what Cutter is saying. He's not in the moment. He's somewhere else. His mind is somewhere else. He's lost in these memories. He's thinking about Surly. He's thinking about the Talons. He's thinking about this history. He's thinking about his history with Hawl. He's thinking about the training that he gave them, that they went through, the missions they went on. That is where Cotillion's mind is. That's why when Cutter says something so horrible that you would expect the god of assassins to immediately smack him down, he doesn't, because he's not listening to Cutter. Cutter is irrelevant. Cotillion's mind is not in that glade. He's lost in these memories in exactly the same way that we would be when confronted with the death of a loved one. We're not all there. Our minds go to other places. We're contemplative. And I think this adds such an element of depth to his character that we often overlook, because this isn't one of the cool action scenes. This isn't one of those big scenes where lots of plot developments happen. This is a very quiet, slow, gentle scene that it's very easy to skim through quickly. And yet there's so much here that is all about character, about the character development. And then we have this moment towards the end where Cutter asks, what do you think she was doing here? And Cotillion flinched slightly. And if you think of this, Cotillion, his mind has been elsewhere. He's not been in the moment. He hears what Cutter says, and it suddenly brings him back. He remembers where he is. He remembers he's standing in this glade. All this stuff is going on in the world, the machinations and the schemes that he and Shadowthrone are involved in, their plans, all the different things happening on the different continents. All of this is coming flooding back to him that he had ignored, that he had stepped away from, he had temporarily forgotten because he was lost in this memory of Hawl. And he flinches. And if you think of that, think of what the god of assassins has to be thinking in order to flinch. This is a guy with nerves of steel. He is a god, the god of assassins. Nothing phases him. And yet he flinches and then starts babbling. He just starts saying these questions. The wrong question, Cutter. Rather, why was she with Traveller? What is the Talon up to? And Traveller, gods, did he know who she was? Of course he did. Oh, she's aged and not well, but even so. This is not the Cotillion we know. This is not the calm, possessed, in control god of assassins. This is someone who has been shaken and is trying to get back to themselves and is babbling slightly. Why would he talk to Cutter about these things? This has nothing to do with Cutter. Cutter's not going to know about Traveller. He's not going to know about the Talons and what is actually going on with that. Cotillion is covering for not being in the moment. He's flustered. The god of assassins is flustered. And I think that tells us an awful lot about his character. But moving on then to the sequence with Shadowthrone. And in this, like, Cotillion thinks of Hall's body as he's carrying it as his burden. And this is, symbolically, if you go back to the start of that section we just discussed, it opens with Cutter carrying Apsalar, his burden, and here we have it mirrored. Cotillion is carrying Hall's body, his burden. That those metaphorical readings or the symbolism I was attaching to that can apply equally well here. That this is not just the physical burden of her body. He's a god. He has additional strength. This isn't a burden. It's quite light for him. But this is the burden of history, the burden of decisions, the burden of memory, the burden of regret, the burden of loss and grief. That is the burden he is carrying. And when Shadowthrone appears, we get the line, "For a change, the god said nothing for a long time." Shadowthrone we've seen time and time again, cackling and slightly mad, and we were always wondering, is he insane? Is he a genius? Is he both? And here we see, when he appears, he sees Cotillion, his friend, his partner, the person who ascended with him, the person he trusts most, or it's the only person he trusts. He sees Cotillion standing there and respects the silence. He doesn't interrupt. He doesn't order Cotillion around. He doesn't crack a joke. He doesn't tell Cotillion to hurry up. He sees Cotillion standing there. He sees Hall's body and knows and understands what his friend is going through. And he even says, "How many times do our followers have to die, Cotillion?" And he says it with a sigh. So even here, we're getting a sense of Shadowthrone's humanity, that a lot of his madness, a lot of his eccentricity is a front. It's put on. That's what he presents to other people. But here, in this moment, just between him and Cotillion, he's not performing for anyone. This is a moment of honesty for Shadowthrone. And it's for a moment where we, the reader, get to see the honest Shadowthrone. And I think this implies a great deal about their friendship, about the level of trust that Shadowthrone places in Cotillion and that Cotillion places in Shadowthrone. Shadowthrone respects his friend's sorrow. Shadowthrone is giving him this moment. Shadowthrone cares about the fact that one of their followers, one of their friends, died. And he's not flying into a mad rage going, oh, Lucine will pay for this, or they will pay for this. This is a human reaction of grief and loss. And even here, you get a sense of the remorse and regret. That again, we're talking about this journey, these decisions that they made together led to this moment, and they understand it, that they acknowledge it. And that adds a depth and complexity to both these characters. But it's not spelled out in the text. What is spelled out is Cotillion names the most important thing is friendship. Friendship becomes the central aspect here. It is highlighted in the text. And what we see is the friendship that Kellumbed and Dancer had with Hawl, that Shadowthrone and Cotillion had with Hawl, and that when they ascended, Hawl thought that they had died and thought that they had disappeared, thought that they were no longer there. And Shadowthrone and Cotillion didn't correct that. Hawl thought that they had gone away, and they say, but the major thing is they didn't go away in the most important aspect, which was as friends. They were still there. They had these plans. All of these things involved them not revealing who they were, but they still maintained that emotional connection, friendship, and they list it as the most important. And for the god of shadow, for the god of assassins, to be concerned with friendship. So I think this whole sequence, including the sort of the sad, bittersweet humor that's worked in to balance the tone, this sort of reference to friendship, these moments of grief, how they interact with each other, I think these are wonderful, revelatory moments about their characters. But so little of it is on that surface level of what we are being told. Almost all of this is beneath that surface level. But that's just my opinion of this. That's just my reading of this. I'd be really interested to see and to hear what you think about those two sections, about the development of character in this. So please, by all means, leave some comments. Tell me what you think of the relationship between Cotillion and Shadowthrone, whether or not you think I've read this correctly or I've misread it. I look forward to reading them. And thank you again for watching. I really appreciate it.